fathers do so much less with children that the room for change, the opportunity for growth here is much greater with father interventions.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. By the time kids get to school, we want them to be happy, healthy, and well socialised. And mothers traditionally do most of that work, and so they are targeted by most of the programmes that focus on early childhood development. But what role do fathers play? What difference would it make if they did more? And how could policy incentivise them to do exactly that? Dave Evans of the Inter-American Development Bank and Pam Jakiela of Williams College have just published a review of the evidence about these questions. They join me now. Pam, welcome.
Thank you.
And Dave, welcome back, I think it is, isn't it?
It's true. Thanks so much, Tim.
Pam, when we talk about investments in early childhood development, specifically, what behaviours are we seeking to promote here?
When we talk about early childhood development, we're thinking in terms of what's called the nurturing care framework. We know that what kids need to reach their developmental potential is a combination of a safe environment, good health, and the right investments in preventive health care, enough nutrition, and importantly, responsive caregiving from their parents and opportunities to begin learning, for early learning, to build on the skills they're going to need when they get to school. When we think about ECD interventions, we're usually thinking about things that are trying to work on one of those margins.
What do we know about how that helps children?
We know that early life is a sensitive period for child development, and these types of investments, health investments and investments in cognitive stimulation, are critical for allowing children to develop to meet their full potential. And we know that when children are not getting enough nutrition and early childhood stimulation, they're at risk of not developing, not being on track to build the human capital that they need. We also know that policy can help here, and that improving in these types of early investments in human capital, in health, and in cognitive development can have really important impacts throughout childhood and throughout the life course.
Today, we're talking about getting fathers more involved. This seems like a very good idea, but is this substituting for the mother's role, giving them more chance to do other things, or are we saying that more nurturing, this time provided by the father, can supplement the mother's role?
It's a really interesting question. I've been thinking about it a lot. It's not clear from a theoretical perspective. I mean, one thing is that we know that 43% of children in low and middle income countries are not getting enough nurturing care inputs. And so we would like more investment overall. Mm-hmm. But we also know that in low and middle income countries and also in high income countries, women bear a disproportionate share of the burden of domestic chores and also care work. We might like to equalize that, both so that children can benefit from close relationships with their mothers and their fathers, and to distribute the burden more evenly within the household. We really do think it's both, that we would like kids to have more engaged, responsive parenting from their family members, but also we would probably like to see a shift toward greater equality and greater father engagement.
Fathers can't help at all if they're not present. How often are fathers absent?
It is much more common for children in low and middle income countries to live without their fathers than without their mothers. Mm-hmm. So as part of this review, we looked at UNICEF data from 69 countries, and we found that more than 90% of children live with their mothers, but only about 70% of children live with their fathers. So more than 1 in 4 kids are living without fathers in their home. Now, of course, this varies a lot around the world. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the lowest proportion, only 60% of kids live with their fathers. Gosh. So like you say, those fathers can't be providing that early childhood engagement and stimulation if they're just not home.
Why aren't they around?
In some cases, of course, fathers have passed away tragically or parents have separated. In other cases, fathers migrate, and so in those cases, they may be sending resources home. But one of the striking findings that we see from studies that examine the impact of not having a father in the home is that for the outcomes that we can measure most easily, like health outcomes and education outcomes, honestly, we don't see a very large impact. And so in studies in Kenya, in South Africa, in Guatemala, elsewhere, we see that whether a father has migrated away or if a father has passed away, the impact on children's education, on children's health, tends not to be very strong. And this foreshadows what we'll see about how little a lot of fathers are doing with their children when they are home.
You have a big sample here, though, a lot of countries in your data. So in which cultures are fathers spending the most time with their kids? Which countries do they spend the least time with them?
The first thing I'll say is that we don't have perfect data on time use. And so the question that you just asked specifically is a difficult one for us to answer. What we have is really good data, again, from these UNICEF multiple indicator cluster surveys in 69 countries about the types of stimulating activities that parents and other household members do with children. So this is from a module called the Family Care Indicators that's been used around the world. And it asks about activities like singing with the child or playing with them or reading them a story. 6 different types of stimulating activities that we think of as these types of early stimulation investments. And so we can see not only how much stimulation of this type children are getting, but also who's doing it. It's very clear that mothers are doing a lot. They're doing more than fathers. They're doing more than other adult household members. In most regions of the world, fathers are doing less than other adults within the household, whether it's grandmothers or older sisters or even older brothers. Yeah. So fathers are doing relatively little. And there's some variation in this. There's actually more variation in how much mothers are doing of these stimulating activities, with mothers doing the least in sub-Saharan Africa, but also relatively less in South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific, and doing substantially more in Europe and Central Asia, the Middle East and North Africa. We see similar patterns among fathers. So stimulation by mom, stimulation by dad, they're very strongly correlated. It's not like in some families and some countries or cultures, moms do the stimulating activities with kids, and in other countries or cultures, dads do it. The correlation between these two variables across countries is about 0.88, so it's really super high. But we also see variation where fathers are doing the least in sub-Saharan Africa and again in Asia, and they're doing the most in the Middle East and North Africa and also Europe and Central Asia. There's a ton of variation among fathers, a ton of variation among mothers, but across countries, these things are really strongly correlated.
In many of these places, the role of women is changing. Not in all of them, and we might want that to be changing faster. They are more likely to work outside the house. They are perhaps having fewer children and investing more in each child. Now, has the role of the father been changing because of these changes that are going on in the household?
Yes. Here, it might be worth mentioning some of what we know about what's happening in the United States and in rich countries, because I think it speaks to these types of changes. Over the last few decades, fathers are doing more, but mothers are also doing more. It isn't the case that the burden is particularly equalizing or is on track toward equalizing. As we learn more about the importance of investments in early childhood, everyone seems to be doing somewhat more. And so I do think the role of fathers is slowly changing in low and middle income countries and also in high income countries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are catching up to mothers in terms of the amount of investments they're making, the time they're spending with their children, etc.
On VoxDevTalks over the years, most of the early childhood development programs that we have covered, things like Bolsa Familia, have targeted the household or targeted the mother directly. Is this, generally speaking, the case with these programs?
So there's some early childhood programs that work through centers, like daycare centers or preschools, but the vast majority of early childhood development interventions that somehow target the family, exactly like you say, are focused on the primary caregiver, and in most cases, that's the mother. So on the one hand, it makes sense to reach out to the parent who has the most interaction with the child, because that's where you might think we can really make a difference with what's happening with this child. But on the other hand, fathers do so much less with children that the room for change, the opportunity for growth here, is much greater with father interventions.
These policies that are targeting for instance, the household, or these policies that are targeting interventions outside the home, are they changing the behavior of fathers at all? Are they making use of this, as you say, room to change? Or do we really need to target the fathers more specifically if we're going to be expecting change?
One of the surprising findings in our review is that programs that don't target fathers often do have positive impacts on fathers' engagement with their children. So, for example, we found parenting programs in 3 different countries, Pakistan, Rwanda, Tanzania, that were all primarily targeted towards mothers. Most of the education and intervention happened with mothers, and yet all 3 of these programs positively affected fathers' engagement with their children. Now, it doesn't happen every time. We found a counterexample in Bangladesh where it didn't have that effect.
Okay.
But there is hope that at least some change can be achieved indirectly.
Is it the case, though, that fathers just, maybe they just don't know what they should be doing? They don't know that if they had more involvement at this stage, it would be a good thing. Does teaching them about early childhood development, does that make a difference? Does that help?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's where the picture starts to get tricky.
Mm-hmm.
So there have now been a number of studies. It's still a very small literature, but it's growing rapidly. Number of studies with interventions that tried to target fathers, either randomized whether the mother or the father was targeted, or were just explicitly targeting fathers or targeting couples. These interventions often just fail to get fathers in the door.
Mm-hmm.
So in many cases, you target fathers, but maybe they don't already prioritize their interactions with their kids, and so they don't participate or they're busy. Many of these interventions simply just can't get father engagement. When we do get father engagement, we tend to see that interventions do change fathers' knowledge and understanding of the importance of early childhood nurturing care, health and nutrition, and cognitive stimulation. But even when we change fathers' knowledge, it doesn't necessarily translate into behavior as readily as it does with mothers. One interesting example is a study by Martina Bjorkman-Nyqvist and Seema Jayachandran in Uganda, where they targeted either mothers or fathers for children's health and nutrition classes. And they found that whichever parented was targeted learned a lot. And when fathers were targeted, there was a knowledge spillover onto mothers. But it was only when you targeted mothers that this translated into changes in behavior. Even when we can change fathers' knowledge, the norms in the household, the norms around parenting seem like they're often sticky enough that it's not enough to get fathers to change what they're doing and to impact outcomes for children.
Although a lot of this seems surprising when we talk about it as data, I think a lot of people around the world are saying, yeah, that's my experience.
A lot of moms.
Is it the case, perhaps, that we just need to be more persistent with the fathers because maybe they're resisting the programs harder that are targeting them more so than mothers would do?
Just to add to Pam's example, I was working with the government of Mexico a few years ago to evaluate a parent training program that had historically been targeted to mothers. And the government wanted to roll out a version of it that would target fathers. We set up an evaluation plan to do that. And in the end, it proved impossible to evaluate simply because no fathers showed up for the program.
Wow.
The question, like you say, is, are they resisting? So a recent study in Tanzania asked fathers what keeps them from these programs. And fathers said they had different time constraints than moms did. There are certain gender attitudes that are culturally informed in different countries that make fathers more reluctant to engage. And I think a finding from a review last year by Joshua Jong and others, they looked at the father intervention programs. And basically all of the father intervention programs looked like someone had taken a mother intervention program and then done find and replace mother with father. They hadn't adapted the programs. They hadn't thought about fathers' specific obstacles or specific needs. And without that creative thinking, I don't think we're going to be able to see the changes in father behavior that we want to see.
So we perhaps need to think more carefully about what would change fathers' behavior. Is there a way that we can describe the benefits of early childhood development, measure them in a way that would give fathers more incentives to take part in this?
I think there are two pieces to this. One is the piece that we don't know, which is the actual evidence of these fathers' interventions on children's outcomes. As we said with these studies we've reviewed, there's some evidence it changes fathers' knowledge. There's less evidence that it changes fathers' behavior. And because there's so little evidence that we've changed fathers' behavior, we don't have a bunch of evidence we can point to that says, oh my goodness, look at the benefits to the children where we changed these fathers' behavior, because it hasn't happened so much. Even in high-income countries, we've done some looking, and even there, we don't see so much evidence there. The first thing that we need to do is generate more evidence about what these changes in father behavior can do. What's the potential here for children's development? On the other hand, I do think emphasizing the overall benefits of early childhood stimulation can be one element, especially as you mentioned, Tim, with mothers working more hours. There's an opportunity for fathers to step up and deliver those same benefits that we see from early childhood stimulation.
Is there a program that has worked, that has made a difference, that you could say to policymakers, try and adapt that?
It's hard to find really successful examples. And when we only have a couple of examples, it's hard to know, is this something about a particular context or environment, and is it really generalizable? That said, one example is the Rwanda Banda Bareho program, which is a program that targeted couples trying to intervene to reduce intimate partner violence and also change norms within the household and within the couple. This had pretty durable impacts on couple outcomes, but also on child outcomes. This highlights something that Dave was saying, which is that we don't want to think about intervening to change fathers' behaviors in the same way we intervene to change mothers' behaviors. We have to recognize that fathers are coming from a different cultural space in terms of their engagements with their kids. And if we want them to be more involved, we should design programs that are specifically targeted to the types of interactions that would be culturally appropriate and natural for fathers to have with their kids. It's important here to be really careful. So in some cases, we've actually seen counterintuitive negative impacts of engaging with fathers. And more broadly, even when we don't, if we open up what was a female-dominated space within the household, within parenting, and get fathers more involved, we may be undermining our efforts to get mothers more involved and give them more agency and empower them to be more proactive with their children and their children's education.
Tell me more about these counterintuitive negative reactions that we're getting. What's happening?
I was thinking of a study by Amaral and co-authors in El Salvador, where they were looking at an online parenting program that targeted either a male caregiver or a female caregiver, and actually found that the intervention reduced the quality of interactions and also had negative mental health effects, possibly because it was highlighting ways in which the way you had been interacting with your kids wasn't sufficient, wasn't developmentally optimal. We're not exactly sure what the mechanism is, but it seems like engaging fathers can highlight the fact that you're not doing enough without necessarily giving you the culturally appropriate tools to change behavior in a way that works for you and works for your children. More broadly, we see that when we are intervening with fathers instead of mothers, when interventions go through and find and replace mother with father, we can take a program that is effective. And we know that interventions for mothers can be effective for kids and also can improve mothers' mental health. And we can miss that opportunity by trying to engage fathers and blowing our chance to intervene in a way that helps children and mothers.
When I think, though, about all the times that we've discussed programs to help mothers in the ways that you're talking about here, this is possibly the first time that we've ever discussed specifically how we incentivize fathers. One lesson I draw from that is perhaps policymakers aren't really very invested in getting fathers involved at home. Perhaps they're more interested in getting them involved in the labour market. If you were sitting down in front of a policymaker, what arguments would you use to convince them that they should be targeting the father in early childhood development?
The economy is changing. And we know that in rich countries and in poor countries, women struggle to make the sort of investments they need to with their children to put their children on the right developmental path, and also to engage with the labor market, both because they need to and because it is women's right to have economic agency and to be involved in economic activities outside of the household. So I think it is important both that we see fathers, as we've talked about, as an area where there's a ton of scope for greater responsive parenting, greater early childhood stimulation. And also we see that it is a policy goal in itself to equalize, or at least shift in the direction of equality, the domestic and care work burden across the household. But I think counterintuitively, it's really important to do this cautiously and not just to go in and universally promote fathers' engagement. That we really want to think about maybe engaging mothers to think about what the right way to engage fathers is, so that we do this in a way that is culturally appropriate, but more than that is constructive and is actually going to be successful in the context in which we're working.
I think that the trade-offs here are not the kinds of trade-offs we might be worried about. Question here is not really about interventions that are saying, hey, let's get fathers out of the labor force and no longer working and instead being full-time parents. Of course, that's an option. We've seen positive effects of countries that introduce things like paternity leave to boost fathers' engagement with their children. But a lot of what these parenting programs have the potential to do is just increase at the edges, at the margins, what fathers are doing when they are home. So this isn't necessarily about sacrificing a household income. This is about taking advantage of time, pushing against gender norms so that fathers are engaging with their children, helping those children to develop before they set foot in a classroom, assisting that effort so that kids have the very best possibilities in life, and the burden isn't entirely on mothers to make that happen.
I wonder what sort of conversation we're going to be having about this in 15, 20 years. I hope it's a different one. For now, Pam, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And Dave, thank you as well.
Thank you, Tim.
The paper is called The Role of Fathers in Promoting Early Childhood Development in Lower Middle-Income Countries, a review of the evidence. And the authors, David Evans and Pamela Jakiela. It was just published, in the World Bank Research Observer. There is also a blog called What Do Fathers Do? 5 Findings on the Role of Fathers in Early Childhood, which does a great job of summarizing what the paper has to say. That was published on June the 13th in the Primeros Pasos blog at the Inter-American Development Bank. This has been a VoxDev Talk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you like VoxDev Talks, please review us, leave us a rating, and then more people can hear great episodes like this one.